The question is, what is the pertinent message that this particular story delivers to us on this day? So I want to just read with you for a moment the context of the story, perhaps ask some questions as we go through the text itself, and then through the to hopefully understand what that message is. The Gemara says like this. There are many questions we could ask. The Talmud opens the story with the following statement by Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my dichtiv. What is it that it says in Tehillim? Ashrei Adam mefached tamid umakshe libo yipol bera'a. Greater praise is a person who is consistently afraid, someone who is stubborn, brazen-necked. That person will have evil fall upon him. In other words, someone who is abrasive or who is not cognizant, doesn't recognize, doesn't want to recognize why various events, including bad ones, of course, are transpiring around him, then obviously that's not a good thing. So the Gemara says immediately, Al Kamsa Bar Kamsa. In other words, as if we're supposed to understand the connection between that first pasuk that appears in Tehillim and immediately the story, which the Gemara sojourns into conveniently. Al Kamsa Bar Kamsa Charva Yerushalayim. With regards to Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, the first question is, what exactly did Kamsa do wrong? Kamsa is not even in the story. We'll see in a moment. Kamsa's lounging around at home, minding his own business, and the Gemara declares that this poor Yepel was the destruction or caused the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. But what did he do? He didn't do anything. And the Gemara says, Al Kamsa Bar Kamsa Chava Yerushalayim, Hayar Adam Echad, there's a fellow, She'ahad et Kamsa, Bar Kamsa. He loved Kamsa, he powerful emotion. After they got that he couldn't tolerate Bar Kamsa, he absolutely hated. Asasi Uda, he made a meal. Amar Shamsho, he told his servant, lived in South Africa. Sorry. Go and invite Kamsa to the Seudah. Listen to how the Gemara, how it uses the particular language. For him I love. Gemara emphasizes consistently how there was hatred that he had toward Bar Kamsa, but he embraced and loved Kamsa. In other words, we're talking about complete extremes within this emotion. Halacha shamash ve'evi b'ta'ud et Bar Kamsa hasadu. Unbelievable. The Gemara emphasizes over and over and over again. He brought Bar Kamsa by mistake, the one that this guy hated. So obviously the Gemara is transmitting to us a message that if we can so blatantly declare who we love and who we hate, that obviously is problematic. And the Gemara continues. Matzah ba'al habayit et Bar Kamsa yoshev liyad shulchano. He found Bar Kamsa, the ba'al habayit. This Bar Kamsa, he found him sitting next to his table. Amalo, arei oto ha'ish soneh. Strange, because here the Gemara does not say what we would expect. What we would have expected the Gemara to say is that the ba'al habayit, the guy who was hosting the feast, said, all right, this guy Bar Kamsa, I hate him. What's he doing at my feast? Doesn't say that. He says, this guy Bar Kamsa hates me. So everything is within an image. Everything is with regards to how a person sees and how a person envisions what's transpiring around us. And the Gemara continues. Mata Sekan, what are you doing here? Heshib Bar Kamsa, Horelabati, Hanechli, Ve'eten Lechadmei Ha'achila V'Ashtiya Shuli. He says to Bar Kamsa, what are you doing here? Bar Kamsa immediately says, since I'm here already, leave me alone, and I'll give you the money that'll cover my meal. Now, the guy just asked him, what are you doing here? He never said to him, you better pay for your meal. He never said to him, I'm going to throw you out. He never threatened him with regards to anything. And immediately Bar Kamsa is defensive. And he says, just let me stay and I'll pay for my meal. Very strange. Amado Balabayit lo, say Mika. Arabs, out. Eten lecha dmei chatzi sudatek. Bar Kamsa says, I'll give you and I'll pay for half of the feast. Look. Eten lecha dmei kol sudatek. Look. I'll pay for the entire feast. The guy says, no deal. Can't stay. Now listen carefully. Listen to how particular the Gemara is. Natlo biyado. He takes him by his lapel. He'emido. He stands him up. Vehotzio hafutza. The particular detail of every single act possible in order to embarrass and degrade this fellow publicly. He grabs him, picks him up, he stands him in front of everyone, and then he throws him out. So every single possible gesture is taken to embarrass this fellow to the nth degree. And sure enough, the Gemara says, Amar Bar Kamsa, Hoy, the Yashvu Sham Chachamim V'lo Michu B'yado, Ki Nireh Shenoch Lehem B'zeh, Elech Ve'alshin Aleim B'fnei HaMelech. Said Bar Kamsa, since the rabbis were standing at this meal, and presumably they doth not protest. So it seems that it's fine with them. Everything's peachy. They have no problem with the fact that this fellow publicly embarrassed me in front of everyone. I am going to tell on the Jewish people in front of the king. Now, it seems a rather crass, a rather rash reaction. But obviously this fellow is very disturbed. We need to discuss why. Sure enough, Caesar, the Jews are rebelling against you. How do you know? Send for them an animal, and you'll see that they won't offer for sacrifice for the great season. Shalach bi'adav egel. So he sends with this fellow Bar Kamsa a korban, an animal. Kishabala akriv, itilbo mumba svatayim vegesh omrim ba'ayim. Listen carefully. This fellow Bar Kamsa, when he's supposed to bring the animal for offering in the confines of the Mikdash, he decides to place a little nick, a little blemish in this mouth of the animal, and some say in the eye. Now the question is, what's the difference? Why does it matter whether he places the nick in the mouth or the nick in the eye? Either way, they're considered enough of a blemish that you cannot offer this animal for a sacrifice. And in fact, I'm not even sure if there's a halachic argument where exactly is a psul, is a blemish that would nullify your ability to offer the sacrifice. Because I think it's hands down. Whether the cut, the incision is made in the eye or the mouth makes no difference. So why then does the Gemara, the Talmud, have to emphasize where exactly the cut was made in the animal? And the Gemara continues. It's a place that for us certainly is a blemish. For the non-Jews would not be considered a problem to sacrifice. The rabbis now have to figure out what to do. They know that this animal was sent by the Roman emperor. They know that if they don't offer the animal for sacrifice, they're in serious hot water. And at the same time, they know that they cannot offer the sacrifice because it's halachically unacceptable. So they start with a discourse. They say, maybe we should offer the animal for Shalom Malchut, for the sake of peace or keeping the peace amongst the empire. Amar lem Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, remember that name? Comes along Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, who apparently is the Av Beit Din, the head of the Jewish people, the council, and he says, Amru ba'alei mumin kreivin al mizbeach. What's the problem? If we allow this animal to be sacrificed, people will start thinking, oh, I'm allowed to bring the sacrifice with a blemish. So I don't think that's going to go. And he continues, Chashvu laharog et bar kamtza shelo yelech v'yalshin lekesar. Then they said, you know what? Instead of having, listen to how warped this is. Instead of having a scenario where people will think that you're allowed to offer a korban that has a blemish, let's kill Bar Kamsa. I mean, if you didn't read it, you wouldn't believe it. And he says, no, can't kill Bar Kamsa. Why? He says, Amalem Yomru Mul Matil Mum Bekochim Yarek. We can't kill Bar Kamsa because people will then say, oh, someone who brings a blemish in an animal is punishable by death. And that's not the halacha. So you see what I'm getting at here? It's something that I spoke about this morning. There is this calculation of halacha by Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas that is so warped, that has a lack of reality, that has a lack of sensibility. I mean, at the end of the day, you're dealing with the potential mass murder of the entire Jewish populace in Jerusalem. And yet, here is Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas making this calculation of what is halachically and what is not halachically acceptable and how it will be interpreted for future generations. So what you see is that, in all probability, this Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas was so enthralled and so impressed with how his image would look with regards to his halachic discourse, that it was on the cheshbon at the cost of what it would do to the Jewish community. Dare I say, Israeli politics today? Possible. But we're not going to talk Lashon Hara. We'll do that tomorrow night. The Gemara continues. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan said, there's a serious problem with this Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas. An v'tanuto sheRav Zechariah ben Avkulas hichriva et beitenu v'sarfa et eichaleinu v'glitenu me'artzenu. The overzealousness and modesty of this Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas was ultimately what caused the destruction of the temple. It threw us out from the Jerusalem, threw us out into the diaspora, and that's the whole story. Now, obviously, Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas, to be credited with being the one who really was responsible for the Jews being thrown into the diaspora, that's not a great credit to have to his name. And ultimately, that's what happens. But there are many questions that we could ask with regards to this Gemara. Number one, what is the connection between the first pasuk, Ashrei Adam mefached tamid umakshe libo yipol bara? What great is a person, praises the person who is consistently afraid, and someone who is obstinate, doesn't recognize the events that are transpiring around him, he will have bad fall upon him. Question number one. Question number two. If you just read the entire text of the Gemara, I mean, Kamsa is not even mentioned once. What do you want from this guy? All he's doing is sitting at home. And yet he is credited at the beginning of the Gemara as him and Bar Kamsa being the ones who destroyed Jerusalem. Why? Number three, look at the vernacular of the Gemara that is used. She'oto ani ohev, hasanu. This is the one that I love. This is the one that I hate. Why does the Gemara talk about the fact that the Balabayit finds Bar Kamsa sitting next to his table? And Bar Kamsa answers, let me pay for the meal, and we'll call the whole thing off. And the guy doesn't accept it. And then, of course, what are the Chachamim, the rabbis, doing? Standing there as innocent bystanders, allowing this entire chain of events to transpire. Very, very difficult to understand. So let's begin. If we look for a moment at the Gemara in Masechet Brachot says as follows. First, let's deal with the context of the pasuk. The Gemara says, "Hahu talmida dehava ka'azil batrei de Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi b'shuka d'tzion." Now, there are two fascinating things that take place here. Number one, listen carefully. There was a Talmud who was walking batrei. Batrei means behind, in back of Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi. Where? None other than Shuka d'Tzion. Where's Shuka d'Tzion? In Machane Yehuda. That's what it is. Shuka d'Tzion is the Shuk of Zion. Zion, Tzion, is Yerushalayim. So it's amazing that the context of the pasuk with which we began the story of Bar Kamsa is the same exact context. They're going to use that pasuk with an event that transpired in the Shuk of Jerusalem. Not only that, why does the Gemara tell us that Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi's student was walking behind him? Now listen to what happens. Chazeh de kamafchid. Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi saw that his student was trembling with fear. Amar le, chat'at, you're a sinner. Dichtiv, it says in Yeshayahu, v'chado b'tzion chata'im. People who demonstrate fear in Zion, in Jerusalem, the heartland of the Jewish people, they are sinners. One must have more faith. One must demonstrate greater allegiance to God, even in the time of rockets, warfare, threats, and so on and so forth. Amar le, wait a second. What, you're criticizing me for being afraid? V'aktiv, it says in Mishlei, we just read it, Ashrei adam mefached tamid. Praises a person who is consistently afraid. So why are you criticizing me for being afraid? Amar le, hahu b'divrei Torah ktiv. It depends what the context is. Now, it's fascinating because you see, if the student was walking behind Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi, how did Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi know that his student was overridden with fear? The only way he could have done that is if he turned around and looked at his student. So just within that context of the Gemara, it's already demonstrating to us a tremendous insight. A person has to always look behind them to see how the person behind them is doing. It demonstrates Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi's sensitivity. It demonstrates his lack of pompousness, haughtiness. He's walking in front of his student. He is the one who is respected and revered, not the student, and yet he turns to his student to see what his welfare is like. Truly remarkable. And it is only then that he recognizes that his student is overwrought with fear. The student says, what's wrong with being afraid? And the rabbi says back to him, it depends what context. To be afraid consistently is problematic. To be afraid from the words of the Torah, to allow the words of the Torah to circulate and to certainly be a part of you, that's permissible. And so basically what the Gemara is proposing is that everything has to be taken in context. There is no room for extremes. And at the same time, if one does not conduct their lives in extremes, then in all probability, they will not be what's called apathetic. They will react to the things that are going around them. And that's exactly what's happening here. What Rabbi Shmuel beRabbi Yossi is telling his student is, we need to be afraid, but we need to be afraid in the proper context. There are times when we have to live our lives, and we have to move on. And there are times that we have to live our lives and reflect upon what was and what will be tomorrow. But everything has to be within the right context. When a person sees or places things in the proper context, then all of a sudden apathy falls to the wayside because they are completely aware that everything that they do, that everything that they're involved in, that every action that they take has a consequence. And he has to weigh and measure that consequence, whether it counts or not. And sure enough, says the Malbim, a tremendous insight. If we look for a second at the third source down, says the Malbim, in Mishlei it says, Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. Yesh havdel. There is a difference. Bein ha-poched ubein ha-mifached. You see, when we say someone is poched, that means he's afraid. When we say someone is mifached, that means that he infuses himself with fear. It is an action, not a reaction. The Malbim says there's a difference between someone who is consistently afraid, but there's a difference between some people who decide to actively make themselves afraid of the situation that they're in. And therefore, says the Malbim, continues, שהמפחד הוא בדבר שאין שם פחד, רק הוא עושה את עצמו מפחד. והנה הפוחד הוא סימן שהוא חוטא. Someone who is consistently afraid, that demonstrates that he has reason to be afraid all the time. And perhaps he's a sinner. And that's what Rabbi Yosef said to his student. He's telling his student there's a difference between pochet, someone who's afraid all the time because they are fearful that they sin, that they transgress, that it means that something's wrong in the state of Denmark. But someone who is mifached, who opts to make himself afraid, he does so for a reason. And in all probability, good reason. And what is good reason? The words of the Torah that he read. The mitzvot, the commandments that he is expected to keep and to adhere to. He is afraid that he will not live according to the standard that God expects him to. That fear is something that we're supposed to infuse in ourselves. It's something that's supposed to promote a greater loyalty, a greater allegiance to the words of God. And that's acceptable. And so everything has to be weighed and measured accordingly. When we weigh and measure things accordingly, then all of a sudden, apathy falls away because we are consistently calculating every action that we take, everything that we do, everything that happens to us. And the key to this entire story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa is apathy. The inability to recognize that what's transpiring around you has a rhyme and a reason. The Maharal says a tremendous insight. He says the word Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, what does that mean? Kamsa, he says, comes from the word likmotz. Likmotz, kmitza, was actually a process that the Kohen Gadol did in the confines of the temple for the Korban Mincha. Kmitza was taking with his hand, like this, a tithe from the flour in order to put it in to the Korban Mincha. But when one does kmitza, what he's doing is he is actually cutting away from the rest of everything that's around him. He is making everything smaller. It is in a smaller confine. And what he's saying is that Bar Kamsa and Kamsa were komtzim. They were incapable of seeing the world at large. They could only see kmitza. They could only see the immediate parameters of what was going on immediately in front of their faces. But they could not understand, they could not reckon with all of the events that were transpiring around. And therefore, says the Maharal, if you want to know what Kamsa did wrong, it's the very fact that he sat in his house and did not protest, that he was not invited to his loved one's affair. Here's his very good friend, who the Gemara describes as his ahuv. They love each other, and there's a big feast going on, and everyone's invited, and all the rabbis presumably are there, and yet this Kamsa is not included. And it doesn't bother him. He who's in. He's fine. I'm watching Netflix. I got no problem. My friend has a wedding. He's got an affair going on. So it doesn't bother. It doesn't invite me. It's not the end of the world. That, says the Maharal, is problematic. If we are not invited, I know personally, thank God I don't have many friends, so I'm not invited to a lot of things. But when I am invited, the first thing that comes out of my mouth, I'm on my way home. My wife says to me, don't forget, we got a wedding today. He's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Do we really have to go? Can we just send a gift and call it a day? Why did they invite me? We didn't invite them. And then my wife will say, well, we got to invite them because they invited us. And I say, why did they invite us? I don't know why. Why am I paying a price for that? And all of you know exactly what I'm talking about because all of us have those reactions. Oh my God. But that's exactly what the Maharal says. The problem that we don't feel an affinity with one another, that this Kamsa is sitting on his lounge couch like a potato and he's not involved in the social scene, that his friend is making a scene that he's not there. That itself justifies the Gemara saying, Al Kamsa Ubar Kamsa. Nechrava Yerushalayim. Kamsa was also part of that apathy, of that lack of emotion, of that lack of interest that caused the destruction of Yerushalayim. And we continue. The fact that the Shamash himself, the messenger is sent out, he's told to go to bring the invitation to Kamsa, and he goes to Bar Kamsa. What's the problem with that? What it demonstrates is that this Shamash, this servant, who is very, very, or supposed to be attuned to the fine difference between someone that this guy loves and someone that he absolutely hates, makes that mistake. Again, the lack of regard to someone's sensitivity. His boss, his balabayit, does not like, he hates Bar Kamsa. Why would you make that mistake? How could you mistake their identity and cause this entire fanfare to transpire? So the shamash, the servant, is also problematic. And then we get to Bar Kamsa. This is truly amazing. Let's just think about this for a moment. Here's a guy who the Gemara says absolutely, blatantly hates your guts. You hate each other. And all of a sudden, he invites you to an affair, to a feast. By the way, most commentaries say that it was a very, very important feast. And the fact that when the guy says, Hoil v'chachamim lo michu bi'adam, the rabbis didn't protest, it means that the rabbis were there. Now, we all know why rabbis go to affairs. To raise money. It's the only reason why rabbis go. All present company excluded. But we go to affairs because we're trying to fish out who's got the bucks, who do we have to entertain, who do we have to be nice to, who do we have to be sweet to, because at the end of the day, we need to fundraise. That's what rabbis do. I want to tell you something. I will not say which community this is, but it's Tishba. If I had given this shir on Shabbat, I would have told you which community it was. It would have been a lot more fun. But I went to a community once, I kid you not, I was flabbergasted. It was Erev Shabbat, and a cab picked me up, and I'm looking at my watch, and it's really getting late, like close to Shabbat, and I'm supposed to go speak at this dinner on Friday night. I'm thinking, this is really getting tight. Where is this cab driver? So eventually they came, get me to shul, whisk me away to the synagogue, beautiful, gorgeous, grandiose synagogue. And I run in thinking, gee, I really, really have got to, catch mincha. I run in and I see someone. I said, is there mincha? He said, no, we already finished mincha. I said, okay, I'll go to a room, I'll daven by myself. And after mincha, I figure I'm going to go in, I'm going to catch Shabbat. It's already getting close to Shabbat now. It's, the time's upon us, tefillah. I kid you not, half the shul is sitting in the shul waiting for davening. And where is the other half? The other half are invited to an exclusive whiskey club with the rabbi. They have it every Friday. Only those members are allowed to attend this exclusive whiskey hosting in the shul with the rabbi, and it is exclusively for members who contribute a certain amount of money. And I'm thinking to myself, this is totally insane. I mean, the rabbi, I'm just like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, the rest of the congregation are waiting patiently to daven while the whiskey tasting is going on in another exclusive room that they're not allowed into because they're not contributing enough money. Now, someone tell me, is there something wrong with the picture that I just painted? Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this is not what Judaism has in mind. Now, here's a guy, this Balabite, he's got this beautiful feast going on. He invites Bar Kamsa. So Bar Kamsa is not a complete moron. I mean, this guy hates my guts. And he finally has invited me to his feast. So you would think, I'll go to Kosher World and I'll buy him some mint chocolate covered marshmallows. The reason why I say that, by the way, I'm sorry to bring up food. I admit to. But I never tasted those before until Shabbat. And they're good. But I mean, like get some marshmallow, go to next to Kosher World, get the flowers, I mean, just bring something for the guy. He's showing you that he wants to make partisan with you. He wants to be a friend of yours, companionship. So you don't show up empty-handed. I mean, this is a wondrous opportunity to bridge the gaps between you. Now listen to what the Gemara says. The guy's walking around his affair, and where does he find Bar Kamsa? He finds Bar Kamsa not around the hall. He finds Bar Kamsa Yoshev Liyad Shulchano. The guy, not only does Bar Kamsa come to the party, he doesn't even go over to the Balabait and say Shalom Aleichem. It's so nice of you to. By the way, I'm guilty of this, right? If I go to the wedding that my wife makes me go to, I'm going and I have not yet ate dinner. The first stop that I'm making is the sushi bar. You're not going to necessarily, okay, I'll say Mazel Tov later, they're busy, I'm hungry, I got to eat. And that's what many people do. They go, first stop is the dinner, they don't want to miss the smorgasbord, and they don't want to miss all the stuff that, all the delicacies. I mean, come on. And here's Bar Kamsa, and he goes straight to the sushi bar, straight to the smorgasbord, and straight to the table that is top table next to this Balabaya. I mean, what's wrong with this guy? He has absolutely no social class at all. He has no recognition of how he's supposed to behave. It's truly remarkable. And so the Balabait's walking around, and all of a sudden he sees this guy, Bar Kamsa, not at the wedding, at the top table of the wedding, sitting and fussing at his affair that he never invited him to. Now, it reminds me, a few weeks ago, we read in Parshat Ba'alotcha, Bnei Yisrael come out of Mitzrayim, and they actually have the audacity to say to Moshe Rabbeinu, they say like this, Zacharnu et hadaga asher achalnu b'Mitzrayim bechinam, et hashuim, et ha'avatichim, et ha'kishuim. I mean, it's unbelievable. They turn to Moshe and they say, Mi yachilenu basar. Where's the beef? Which proves, by the way, that all of the Jewish people at the time were South Africans. Because they were highly disturbed. You're giving me milchets, you're giving me bread. I need beef. Where's my biltong? And sure enough, they say it to Moshe. And not only do they say to Moshe, they say, I remember the delicacies that we had in Egypt for free. But they forgot that just a year ago, you were in Egypt in the bowels of slavery. You were enslaved. You were persecuted. You were killed and watered into bricks. That's all forgotten. And all they're concerned about is food. It's incredible. In fact, Moshe loses it. And we'll see tomorrow in the keynote, he just cannot contain himself. And he says, Anochi herati et ha'am hazeh? Anochi hariti et ha'am hazeh? Was I impregnated with these people? I don't want them. I'm not dealing with them. And the question is why? What caused Moshe to go over the edge at this particular juncture? I mean, there are a lot of opportunities for Moshe to say, these people I'm not dealing with them. But here he does. Why? The reason why Rabbi Sachs explains it this way, he says, here's Moshe talking about spirituality, the Torah, and they're crying, where's the beef? And he's like, we are just not on the same wavelength. Well, it's the same thing. In fact, the Torah says that when God sends these shlabim, these birds that are consumed by the Jewish people for meat, it says, Abasar odenu ben shineim. The meat is still sticking in between their teeth, and then their stomachs explode, and they're all killed. And it reminds me of this scenario. Because here's this guy, I mean, imagine, the Balabaya comes across, he's ready to sit down at this feast, and he sees this guy, Bar Kamsa, who he hates. And he says, what are you doing here? And Bar Kamsa has food in his mouth, oozing out of it. He doesn't know where to put himself. He says, oh, listen, I'll pay for my food. And the guy is just getting more disturbed. So the whole scenario is this lack of understanding of social norms, this lack of regard to sensitivity of what a person might be experiencing at that time. So Bar Kamsa is responsible for the destruction of the temple. And this guy throws Bar Kamsa out. Now, obviously, that's wrong. But Bar Kamsa doesn't pick on the fellow. He says, I understand why the guy threw me out. He hates my guts. But the rabbis did not protest. They couldn't say anything. Well, you know why the rabbis didn't protest? It's a very simple answer. The Gemara says, listen carefully, it haunts us to this day. Baal Hameya, Baal Hadea. He who hath cash makes decisions on the board. Did we hear that? The richest guy makes the decisions what happens in the community. Now, I've seen this in communities across the United States, small communities who are controlled by one benefactor who has all of the money, and it's incredible because you can have insane, ridiculous decisions being made in the Jewish school or in the Jewish synagogue, but they'll do it because the guy with the money needs to be appeased. And this is what makes him happy. Even though it'll destroy our children's education. Hey, someone's got to pay the bills. And it happens all the time. That's exactly what happens at this Gemara. Here's the guy who says, why didn't the rabbis protest? I mean, the guy's embarrassing me. He's throwing me out by my lapels in front of everybody. My life is ruined. The Jewish community are laughing at me. And the reason why the rabbis didn't protest is because the guy who's holding the feast has a lot of money. And they're not prepared to sacrifice the contributions to their institutions al cheshbon for the sake of one guy not to be embarrassed. And the Gemara says that's a problem. The Gemara is telling you, you can't dictate policy according to who pays the bills. You have to dictate policy according to what's right, according to what's ethical, according to what's valuable. And human life supersedes everything. And that's exactly what the Gemara is telling us. And what's amazing is that the Gemara even describes, it's interesting because the Gemara gives a name to Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, even though it might not have been their real names. But the Gemara does not ascribe a name to the fellow who hosted the feast. We have no idea who he is. All he's called is Adon, the guy who hosted the feast. So one reason why, a simple reason why, is because this story did not take place. But the other reason why is because whenever there is what's called an ilum sheikh, forget it. And anyone know how to say it? Yeah, that. when there is anonymousness, which is not a real word, but when there's anonymous, it's doing it for a reason. It's because the person has not earned a name. In the Bible, the context of the Torah, you have to earn a name. And that's why if you look at Perek Bet, when Abraham and Yocheved and Shmot, when they give birth to Moshe, it says, Vayelech ish mibeit Levi, vayikach isha mibat Levi. A man took a woman, and they had Moshe. They had a baby. It doesn't say their names. In Perek Vav, when it says, Hu Aaron Moshe, asher otziem et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, vayikach Amram et Yocheved dodato liisha. There it says Amram and Yocheved. Why? Because they have earned a name. They have allowed their son Moshe to ascend to the leadership of the Jewish people. He's responsible, takes him out of Mitzrayim. Now you get a name. In the Gemara, this guy does not get a name because his behavior is not acceptable. And then you have the calculation of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis. You ask yourself, what is wrong with this rabbi? How can he even think? And the reason why is because Hashochad Yaver Einei Hatzadikim. Money causes us to think in a warped way. If money dictates our halachic policy, then leaders are capable of making plenty of misguided miscalculations that are immoral. And we see it all the time. And that's exactly what's happening. And what's fascinating is, if you look at the Lashon of the Midrash, there's a very interesting thing. There's a lack of security in the leaders to be able to make a decision. And they go back and forth. And in the end of the day, by the way, Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas does not make a decision. He does not lead his community. He does not make an absolute conclusion or consequence in order to decide what to do with this fellow. And it's interesting because the generation prior to the Messiah is typically called Pnei Hador Kepnei HaKelev. The generation's face is like the face of a dog. Why? Rabbi Yisrael Salanter explained that when a person takes a dog, so a dog is man's best friend. And he takes the dog and leaves the dog, and the dog goes on a lead. What the dog will always do, is the dog will always turn his face back, his head back to see where his master is, to see where the person, even though he's on a lead, he kind of knows that the guy's there, will always turn back to see. Always. Says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, that is indicative of the generation prior to the redemption of the Jewish people, a generation that are incapable of making secure decisions. They are always looking over their shoulders to see who's calling the shots behind them. And that's why Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas could not make this decision. Important decision, monumental decision that may have saved or destroyed the entire Jewish population of Jerusalem. And if you look for a moment at the Midrash Echa Rabbah, which we just read in Echa, is one line different in this story than the Gemara, than the Talmud. And if you look at it, it says, third line from the bottom in the second to last source, Amarlo, Al Tivaysheni, don't embarrass me, said this Bar Kansa. V'ana yativ v'leit ana achil v'shati, and I will sit and I will not eat. Amarlo leit at misuba, you will not stay and recline. Amarle ana yav demei kol adensu, that I'll give you all of your food, I'll pay for the whole feast. Amarle kum lech, you get up and leave. Now listen to what it says here. V'haya sham Rab Zechariah ben Avkulas. Here in the Midrash, it does not say that all of the Chacham stood by and that the guy said, oh, if all the Chachamim, all of the wise men stand by and allow this to transpire, then I'm going to grass on them to the Roman Empire. No, here The Midrash says that just Rab Zechariah ben Abdulas was there by his lonesome. And he said, should I protest? Should I not protest? And he decided, I'm not causing any problems. Let's call the whole thing off. And he let it happen. And that was the last straw. And therefore what happened. Now it's interesting. I asked you, why then does the Talmud have to emphasize to us that he made a blemish in the eye or in the lip? So here's the key. Does it make that much of a difference? It doesn't make a difference within the context of halacha, but it does make a difference within the context of our being able to learn something from this story. At the end of the day, everything comes down to how we see things and to what we say or do not say. The mum was placed in the eye of the beholder, and the mum was placed in the mouth of what we could potentially save an entire people with or destroy them as such. May we know B'Sorot Tovot.